Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And I'm pleased to welcome Dan Poneman. He is the CEO of Centrist Energy, which is the only company, I believe, in the U.S. that is licensed to make HALEU fuel for nuclear reactors. Do I have that right, Dan?
Friendly amendment. We're the only country in the world licensed by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to make high-assay low-enriched uranium for nuclear reactors.
Okay, right. But the Russians don't have to apply for that permit, so we'll leave them out.
Well, you got me on a technicality.
the only company licensed to produce HALEU. So Dan, I didn't warn you. I'm not going to ambush you, but I think you can handle this one. Guests on this podcast introduce themselves. So imagine I've given your title and what your company does, but imagine you arrive somewhere, you don't know anyone, you have about a minute to introduce yourself. Please do so.
I'm Dan Poneman. I grew up in Toledo, Ohio. I wanted to be an oceanographer until I got a summer internship after my freshman year of college with John Glenn, a senator from Ohio, who turned me on to the question of nuclear proliferation. And in fact, believe it or not, I started working on uranium enrichment in the 1970s on the Nuclear Fuel Assurance Act of 1976. And here, almost 50 years later, Robert, I'm about to cut the ribbon on the first new U.S. production, U.S. technology enrichment plant to begin operations and producing enriched uranium since 1954. Between then and now, I've been a lawyer, I've been a consultant, I was Deputy Secretary of Energy, I worked at the White House for 6 years, I tried to stop Koreans and Iranians from getting nuclear weapons, and it's been fun.
I think that's about 60 seconds. So that's very well done. You get an A for that. I like that. Well, so let's talk about, there are a lot of things I want to talk about, but you mentioned enrichment, and you're about to start enriching uranium in a new facility, the first one since the 1950s, which I didn't realize the historic significance of that. But the Oppenheimer movie is just out, and one of the blurbs I saw, one of the discussions of that Oak Ridge National Labs, where they were enriching uranium in between 1943 and 1945, they used something like 1/7 of all the electricity in America for the centrifuges. I'm assuming that was what the power draw. Are you familiar with this?
I am familiar with this.
Yeah,
it's actually
there are a lot of things to talk about with centrist, but power demand is one of them. And this historical fact I thought was quite interesting. Tell me about that.
Well, it's no coincidence that the first three big uranium enrichment plants were all built along the Tennessee Valley Authority hydroelectric system because of just that fact. It drew down enormous amounts of electricity for the technology that was chosen during the Manhattan Project, which was called gaseous diffusion. It required tremendous power, much more than the current generation of centrifuge machines that are now popular. And that is a true fact. Now, there is an perhaps apocryphal story told that, and I don't remember the exact number, Robert, but just call it $100 million in 1944 dollars, but that President Roosevelt called Senator McKellar from the Senate Appropriations Committee, senator from Tennessee, and said, "I have a very important project, a secret project, can win the war. I need you to give me all that money in the budget, but it can't show up. Can I build that plant with that kind of money?" And he said, "Well, yes, of course, Mr. President. Now, just where in Tennessee did you want to put that thing?" And that is perhaps apocryphal, but that it is a true fact that the technology was invented in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, as part of the Manhattan Project. And indeed, our company, which is not a well-known fact, Centrist Energy, is in fact the last standing remnant of the Manhattan Project. It became the Atomic Energy Commission, then it became Department of Energy, and then the only country to privatize this activity in the world of enriching uranium, which is not surprising since it can be used to make nuclear weapons, was the United States. So we are what's left of the Manhattan Project, and that technology has been obviously replaced by subsequent technologies, but we still have and own a manufacturing facility, 440,000 square foot manufacturing facility in Oak Ridge, Tennessee.
So you've seen the movie Oppenheimer then?
I love the movie. Yeah, I sure did. And I'm old enough, Robert, that I actually I at least met and knew some of the people in the movie, the real characters, that is.
Oh, interesting. I've yet to see it. I've heard rave reviews about it, but I'm focused on the electric grid and electricity issues, and I just thought that one number, the 1/7 of all the power consumed in the U.S. over that 2-year period was consumed at Oak Ridge for uranium enrichment is just. I know I can find those numbers. I've got them somewhere, and I have a lot of historical databases. But that's just a crazy amount of energy. And why were the gas? I want to talk about centrifuges and how we make uranium, how we enrich uranium now. But why were those gaseous diffusion? What was that process? How did that work? And why was it so power hungry?
Well, 2 points. One is I can't vouch for the 1/7 number. The number I have commonly heard is 10%, but I have not diligenced that, to use a lawyerly phrase. So, but it's a lot. Okay, point one. Point two.
Diligenced?
That's a
new word for me.
The lawyer in me creeping out, of the former lawyer, recovering lawyer.
No problem.
And of course, the technology to this day is highly classified, but I can talk in terms of the general principles. Basically, the difference between separating out weapons grade uranium and weapons grade plutonium is plutonium can be separated out with a chemical process. But chemically speaking, uranium-235 and uranium-238 are the same element, right? And so you can't like dissolve it in acid and have the 235 show up in one bottle and the 238 show up in another bottle. You have to find a physical process that will discriminate between this slightly smaller, slightly lighter 235 isotope. Why that matters, Robert, is when you asked about enrichment. When you pull uranium ore out of the ground, over 99% of it is uranium-238. Only 0.7% of it is uranium-235. But the 235 isotope is the one that splits easily, creates a chain, self-sustaining, ultimately chain reaction, releases heat, et cetera, et cetera. You enrich to 4 or 5%, and you get enough heat to generate steam, drive turbines, make electricity. Same process, you go up to 90% pure uranium-235. You get either really small, powerful reactors, small enough to fit on a submarine or an aircraft carrier, or you get a nuclear weapon and a mushroom cloud, right? So there were many, many technologies that were analyzed at the time of the Manhattan Project, including magnetic isotope separation, so-called EMIS, et cetera. The gaseous diffusion technology took a barrier and it forced this, at high pressure, it forced this gas. You have to take the uranium ore, turn it into a gas, and you shove it through these barriers. And it just comes out because the holes in the barrier prefer smaller isotope, just a slightly increased concentration of U-235 on the other side of the barrier. So number one, it takes a lot of power to force it through the barrier once. But number two, it's such a slight, tiny increase of concentration of uranium-235. You got to do that many, many times. I don't want to say numbers. I'm not sure what we're allowed to say, but it's both the physical challenge of shoving it through these barriers and then the need to do it over and over and over again to get from that very, very tiny low concentration of less than 1% in the case of the Manhattan Project and the first nuclear weapons up to 90%.
Gotcha. So the new centrifuge process then is far more efficient on from an energy input standpoint. And I don't know how much you can talk about this, but why it's just a more intrinsically more efficient process then?
Yeah, it's just an intrinsically more efficient technology, and you basically spin the gas around, and centrifugal force favors the one weight over the other weight, and then you just basically you draw off that. You still have to do it a lot of times, but you draw it off, and it just doesn't suck down that same enormous amount of electricity that the old gaseous diffusion technology did. We basically dominated that market for decades, Robert. And then when the French got into uranium enrichment, they also did gaseous diffusion. But then basically beginning with Urenco in the 1970s, the industry increasingly turned toward this gas centrifuge technology that you've read about.
Right. And so I want to get into HALEU in just a minute. And again, my guest is Dan Poneman. He's the CEO of Centrist Energy. You can find more about them at centristenergy.com. It's a publicly traded company, trades under the ticker LEU. and you're profitable. As I recall, in the latest quarter, you're making money. Uh, what is you're using it, or you're pioneering a new type of centrifuge? I was in Amori province in Japan in February and saw parts of the centrifuges that they're using there when they begin enriching again for their own fleet of reactors. But as I recall, Centrist is pioneering a new type of centrifuge that's longer or taller, 30 feet or more. There's an efficiency gain to be had if you make your centrifuges taller? Am I reading that right?
Well, we very quickly, Robert, get into an area where probably can't really talk about it in public, but you can actually look on our website and see we do have very, very tall machines. And we believe that they are the most productive machines that exist. And so we're very proud of those machines. And we've actually got well over 3 million hours of runtime on these machines. We've had demo cascades up. We had some technical challenges about a decade ago. Those have all been worked through and now validated. And so they're very tall and they're very efficient.
Uh-huh. So let's talk about the production of HALEU fuel, because I've taught or enriched uranium more broadly, because I've written about this on my Substack, and I've interviewed Matt Wald, who's written some terrific pieces for the American Nuclear Society on this issue of American nuclear fuel supply and why it's a problem. In June, Centrist got permission from the NRC to start producing high-assay low-enriched uranium, HALEU. And this, as you said, is a first. But in talking with people in the industry and that are looking at new reactors, they say we're facing a real fuel availability is our biggest challenge. I talked to a guy just yesterday and saying he's with one of the nuclear startups saying, well, this is our key issue. We need the fuel, but it's a chicken and egg problem in which no one wants to build a reactor if they don't have the fuel. But if you don't have the fuel, you're not going to build the reactor. So am I reading? Talk about the chicken and the egg, because you're going to, if I look at Centrist and what I understand about your business, you need an enormous amount of capital to ramp up, but you're not going to have that capital unless you have solid orders for reactors. Am I understanding your business correctly?
You are 100% spot on. I mean, very
Hey, first time for everything there. That's great.
No, you nailed it. You nailed it. I sometimes, it's funny because it seems so obvious to those of us in the business, but I say, people forget often there was a Stanley steamer.
Yeah.
Steam car. There were electric cars. I can't remember who made it, the electric car. And then in 1908, along comes Henry Ford. And said, I got this. It's black, and I call this thing the Model T, and has got equivalent power of 40 horses. We can pull a plow. You can go to town. You don't have to feed it hay. It's great. And they go like, oh, that's wonderful. What does it go on? Well, you need a thing called gasoline. Well, do you have it? No. I don't, but I don't know. Maybe if the Bolsheviks don't take over, you can get it from the Tsar, and it never would have gone, right? And people have been so waxing rhapsodic about these wonderful new reactors, and they are wonderful, but they don't go. I say no fuel, no fun. So what's the chicken and egg problem? You said it very well. Any nuclear fuel facility costs a lot of money. Like it's a very expensive proposition. And anybody who wants to finance one of those has got to have an order book to show that they're going to have payers. And so I need, a bunch of, just say you need a large number of reactors to justify that. And meanwhile, those reactor developers are running around trying to sell large numbers of reactors, but there's no fuel supply. So you just perfectly yourself captured the challenge.
Although the Russians can provide the HALEU, right? This is a problem now, particularly after the invasion of Ukraine, right? Or do the Russians even have the capability to produce the amount of HALEU needed?
Well, two things. Number one, I think many people up until about 4 p.m. on February 24th, 22 thought that was going to be the answer, because Russia was and is the only commercial source of HALEU, right? And by the way, there's nothing surprising about that, in the sense that Russia has 46% of the world's productive capacity of enrichment overall, including not just HALEU, but traditional low-enriched uranium.
Right.
They have basically moved into the position of dominance that we, in my poor view, disgracefully abandoned over several decades of, basically not paying enough attention, frankly. But here's the thing: they can enrich HALEU for sure, but they don't have to. I mean, they could just blend it down from HU if they felt like it, and they're not a market economy, so they can charge whatever they want. So it's they're out there and they're a significant commercial provider, but we shouldn't mirror image and think that they've got to go through the same hoops that a U.S. company, certainly a U.S. private company, would have to go into in terms of showing a rate of return to investment and so on and so on. They would, and they have traditionally viewed these kinds of fuel supply situations, not only in nuclear, but obviously in natural gas and oil, as geostrategic leverage tools. And so that's what's out there. And I think to me, it's surprising, but it's a fact that it took Ukraine and the invasion of Ukraine for people to realize that that was really not a good idea. And now that people do realize that it's not a good idea, obviously a much better idea is what we all think, and what Winston Churchill, going back to 1913, said is the real source of energy security is diversity of supply. And you don't get diversity of supply without having a new supplier. And that would be, in our case, Centrist.
Right. Well, and I wrote about this on my Substack, and Matt Wald has written about it. And, I'm a big fan of what Matt's work, because he brings such depth of knowledge to it, and I had him on the podcast to talk about this. But looking up the EIA numbers, in the 1980, the U.S. produced a record 43 million pounds of uranium oxide. Today, we're not producing any. We're importing effectively all of the nuclear fuel we need. But this is now over a period of 5 decades, but it was just this inattention. Was this a belief, the market is going to solve this? Was it the megatons to megawatts program? Was it all of these factors that led to this situation where we just have seeded the supply chain for this critical I'm going to call it a commodity. I guess it is a commodity, although it's a strategic fuel. How did we screw this up so badly? Is that a fair, is that the most succinct way to ask the question?
It really is, Robert. And I've written a few books, and I think the way you just described the problem, maybe you just gave me the idea for my next book, because I would love to write this. I won't take a book length time to answer your question. Let me say, bottom line up front, what you said, it was all of these factors. Point one. Point two, when I was in college, we experienced the first oil shock, and I used to write economic papers asking whether energy per se is just a commodity like any other, or whether it's really something different, because and there's a debate. And I would say, to the extent that after the end of the Cold War, there was an increasing view, not unique to the United States, certainly Europe, that treated energy like a commodity. And we, as the United States, I was deputy secretary, we cared a lot about the fact that we had actually gotten into a very dangerous dependence on oil. I mean, remember when we went from like 25 to 33% oil dependence on imports in the oil crisis, Nixon declared Project Independence. It's a national crisis. And we're like over 12 billion barrels a day. So we really fixed that one, right? But on the nuclear side, we didn't fix it. And it's all elements, Robert. You mentioned uranium oxide. That's the ore. Same thing happened on conversion of the solid to a gas. We now just got the new restart of the only conversion facility in the United States, Converdyne has in Metropolis, Illinois. But on the enrichment thing per se, it's a particularly acute, and it is in part because of what you mentioned. And I'm very proud. I was on the original deal team for both President Bush 41 and President Clinton that invented megatons and megawatts. There were, brilliant people at MIT like Tom Neff who conceptualized, but we actually implemented it. And for your listeners, that was at the time the Soviet Union broke up, the huge national security concern was that one nuclear weapon state, the Soviet Union, would become 4, because the nuclear weapons were actually in Belarus, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and Russia. And the scientists would all run around to Iran and North Korea and sell their technology chops, and the materials and technology would flow with them. So we had, both under President Bush 41 and Clinton, an intense effort to stop that. And we called it the hemorrhage problem. And on the subject, I could go on for hours, but I won't. On the subject of enriched uranium per se, we negotiated a deal to buy 500 metric tons of bomb grade, high enriched uranium, 90% pure, from Russia, and convert that to low enriched uranium commercial fuel. That was the equivalent of 20,000 nuclear weapons that didn't end up in Iran. So that's a good thing, right? But here's what happened. This took a national security imperative and lassoed it to a locomotive of the commercial market. So that fuel, which amounted to, in enrichment speak, 5 million separative work units, or SWU, which is how you count enrichment units, per year. And since the United States used about 10 million per year, that meant that half of all nuclear fuel for 20 years, which was the length of the deal, came out of the megatons to megawatts program. And that means, since electricity, 20% of US electricity came from nuclear energy, that 1 in 10 light bulbs in America used to be a warhead pointed at American citizens. So that's a good thing. But I was recently interviewed about this, and if you had hindsight, what would you conclude? And I would say, look, I still think from a non-proliferation standpoint, it was brilliant. But we fell asleep at the switch because it lulled us into a false complacency. And we had 3 big old gaseous diffusion plants, and one by one they shut down, and we did not replace them. And we spent some time working on a different technology, even after privatization, that would use laser isotope separation, which you could talk about later if you like. That didn't work out. Then we went to gaseous diffusion. And by the time the company got ready to deploy gaseous diffusion, Fukushima happened and the whole market collapsed. So through our own inattention and frankly, being somewhat asleep at the switch and complacent, we allowed ourselves to go from the world's biggest exporter of enrichment to the world's biggest importer of enrichment.
Well, and that, thank you. And I know it's a long, we could talk about that for a long time, and whether, the strategic imperative of doing that. But what is it going to take? Give me the number then to bring it back to Centrist, because we talked about the chicken and the egg. You need an order book to justify spending all this money to build the centrifuge plants. And without that, you can't get started. But the investors in these reactors aren't going to want to put the money down unless they're assured of the fuel. What's the number? How much money does Centrist need to build? I mean, it would depend on how much what your output is, right? But as you look at the market, when you give me the number of tons per year, you would be targeting production. How much do you need to get to where you think you're at a reasonable starting point to make all this happen?
Well, you, as in almost all your questions so far, you sort of answered your own question as you asked it, because you're brilliant at framing questions. And I hate to give you an answer like it depends, but it depends. Let me put it to you this way. Traditionally, enrichment plants have cost in the billions. Okay, the first letter would be B.
Okay.
And that's because there are certain scale economies, and typically, plants that get built are built with around a capacity of around 3 million SWU. Now, that is a little bit old think, and to put an analogy to reactors versus fuel, just as we're now thinking of small modular reactors instead of the classic stick-built, very large, bespoke ones that you're very familiar with, so too we are looking at modular production of enrichment, which I think is a smart thing to do. So I don't want to make this sound wooden, but I would just put it to you this way. The numbers that are now bouncing around Congress are good numbers to think about getting started at a level that could be economically and commercially viable. So the House Appropriations Committee, full committee, has put a mark of $2.4 billion over 3 years. There was legislation that was sponsored by Senators Manchin, Barrasso, and Risch, and many others in the end. On the Senate side was authorizing language, but they were talking about $3.5 billion. So I would say, Robert, those kinds of numbers put you in the right zip code of what you're looking at. And by the way, I should note, this is not expecting the government to pick up the whole tab. even though every single enrichment plant in the history of the world has been 100% bought and paid for by governments, we are a privatized company now. So we do need that government support because it's imperative to get us onto the field of play, because every other enricher, of whom there are only 4, are all state-owned enterprises. So we need state support for sure, but we will raise private capital. And if we get the kind of signal that those kinds of appropriations that I just mentioned would provide, we are confident with the market out there and with demand signals that you can talk about, we can talk about more on this podcast, that we can raise the capital we need to get the plant built.
Okay, so to be clear, though, is this 3.5 billion that was in the Advance Act? Is that the one that was included in the? I don't want to get too far into the legislative stuff, but was that the 3.5 billion?
No, if I'm remembering right, because I'm not good at acronyms, even though I worked in arms control for a long time. But I think that was the one that dealt with regulatory issues.
Oh, okay.
This would have been, and actually, it fell out for parliamentary reasons. We won't bore your listeners with of the. I think they called it like the Nuclear Fuel Security Act.
Okay.
And but it's worth mentioning, Robert, because this was astonishing. The National Defense Authorization Act is what's considered widely a must-pass piece of legislation.
Right.
And so therefore, not surprisingly, there were like 900 amendments offered.
Sure.
Which got skinnied down to 21, and this enrichment legislation made it through that wicket. Then it got skinnied down to 14, and then of the 14, 8 actually needed a roll call vote. This legislation passed, listen to this, 96-3. So this is a uniquely bipartisan consensus that the United States has to get back into uranium enrichment.
Okay, so and to be clear, so whether it's 2.4, 3.5 billion, either pick your number, this is money then the government is saying we're going to buy this much fuel, right? That's the commitment that the government would buy it, and then the nuclear reactor companies would buy it then from the government. Tell me what's the appropriation for?
Well, first of all, a lot of that, Robert, would still need to get worked out. Actually, for the federal government, it depends, and I don't want to get into the weeds here. It depends if you're talking about low-enriched uranium or HALEU, high-assay low-enriched uranium. But the bottom line is, typically, just buying the product is not the most efficient way for the government to put money into this sector. What do we need? We need CapEx. We need CapEx. And so think of an analogy to aircraft carriers. If I go to a shipyard and say, I'm going to buy the aircraft carrier from you, go ahead and build it. And when you deliver it in 2032, invoice me, I'll pay you 90 days later. The shipyard is not going to start any work.
Right.
So what we need, and typically look at the Advanced Reactor Development Program, for example, that's done on a cost share. So typically something like this, we would think a cost share would be a very reasonable approach. 50-50 cost share between the government. It shows private sector cares and has skin in the game. It shows the government cares. And this is a national security imperative in multiple dimensions. By the way, we haven't even gotten to this, but the United States needs to enrich uranium to keep our nuclear deterrent alive and to keep our ships running under the oceans and our aircraft carriers as well. So there is a very powerful and compelling public interest in seeing this technology, and I just mentioned one of several reasons why. So I think it's a very easy case, frankly, to make that this is a proper role of government to making this kind of investment.
So the cost share would be, so let's say $3 billion. You get so the $3 billion from the federal government would then go to a project that Centrist would build, or would it be a low interest loan? What would that look like?
There's many flavors that can work. Robert, and by the way, I got to be very clear, which is the Congress would appropriate funds that would be then vested in the Department of Energy to disperse.
I see.
It's not like there's a law passed and says this goes to Centrist. We don't do that in this country.
Yeah, right.
So we fully expect, and not only do we expect, but we welcome the opportunity to competitively bid for such an award, because the American taxpayer is entitled to get the best value for their taxpayer dollars, right? So it's not something that Centrist needs. It's something the industry needs, just to be a little bit technical about it. Point one. Point two, the most efficient way is a cost share. You could do it. You could take a page out of the SpaceX book, and a lot of smart people, probably Matt Wald included, have written about this, where you could actually put a demand signal out there, but then you could have advanced payments against a subsequent purchase that would be based on milestones during construction. There's lots of ways to skin the cat. There's also ways in which if you get a certain level of demand out of, say, the commercial utilities, not for HALEU necessarily because they don't have that need yet, but the existing utilities still have a large need for enrichment, and 20+% is still coming from Russia, and they're eager to replace that. So they could place orders. Those orders could form collateral that you could then take to the loan program office at the Department of Energy, and you could get a loan too. So there's, if there's a will, Robert, there's a way. There's many ways that this could be financed very successfully.
Gotcha. So you signed, thank you. And I know all of this is complicated, and we haven't even gotten to drill down on the different types of fuel, whether it's low-enriched, HALEU, TRISO, et cetera. But in July, Centrist signed or announced a memorandum of understanding with TerraPower, which, of course, famously backed by Bill Gates. TerraPower announced they just recently bought land in Kemmerer, Wyoming, for the Natrium project. Natrium reactors, 345 megawatts. How much HALEU does that one reactor? Can we just drill down to that one project? How much HALEU do they need for that one reactor, and how much HALEU can Centrist? Well, you can produce as much as you can afford, right? You can produce, and you tell me how much you want. We'll scale it. But just for one reactor, give me an idea. How many tons per year would that Natrium project need?
Robert, the reactor developers, I think, view some of these issues about their exact fuel consumption as proprietary. So I would be loath to sort of speak on behalf of TerraPower for how much they need. But let me put it to you. I think I can get to the nub of your question this way. I can tell you what we can do.
Okay.
We are about to, by the end of this year, fire up, as I mentioned, the first cascade, a demonstration cascade to be sure, of new production since 1954. That small cascade of 16 machines will produce around 900 kilograms, just rounded up to say roughly a metric ton, of 19.75% high-assay LEU or HALEU per year. And that assumes we use feedstock, which is conventional low-enriched uranium fuel of 4.95%. If you start from the ground, it would take more, but just start with the stuff you can buy as LEU on the market. We could, with the demand of a few of these advanced reactor developers, build another cascade in 42 months. A cascade, Robert, has 120 machines. That cascade would produce 6 metric tons per year. Once our supply chain is up and running, we can add a new cascade every 6 months. So in short, within 48 months of a decision to proceed, we could be producing 13 metric tons per year of high-assay low-enriched uranium. The U.S. Department of Energy has predicted demand will be 30 metric tons by 2030. There are lots of comments around that demand figure, but what I'm telling you is with that level of investment, which is not, to be clear, the full-up plant of the scale that we were talking about a few minutes ago with the congressional discussion we just had, but we could be providing sufficient HALEU with 2, or if we get more demand, 4 cascades on top of this demo cascade, that we would be able to satisfy the needs of the developing reactor community, I think, very, very well.
So just to review those numbers, Dan, so you could build the cascade in 42 months. How many machines was that again? I'm sorry.
120.
120 centrifuges. And then that would be producing how many tons per year?
6 metric tons of HALEU.
Gotcha. Okay.
So it's 6 metric tons per cascade, and then you get a 1 ton out of the demo cascade. Now, to be clear, the output of that demo cascade will be owned by the United States Department of Energy. The other golden rule: who has the gold makes the rule.
Right.
And so we paid for some of it. It was a cost share, but we've now shifted out of the 3-year cost share contract We're now about to we are starting the so-called operations contract, which we competitively won in a competitive process, which we're happy about. And once we show that we can produce just 20 kilograms, which we're going to do another cost share on, after that, then we turn into a cost plus incentive fee contract with the Department of Energy. But Department of Energy will get all of that product, and
Right.
they will then allocate that presumably to the winners of the Advanced Reactor Development Program grants, right?
Sure. So let's broaden this. Well, I want to talk about the other fuels, right? Low enriched uranium, because as I understand it, the Westinghouse design, the BWRX 300, uses conventional low enriched uranium, as do all the existing reactors that we have in the power reactors we have in the U.S. I want to talk about that in just a minute, but I've been pro-nuclear for a long time, right? You know, in my view, you're anti-nuclear, you're anti-carbon dioxide, you're pro-blackout. Well, I'm anti-blackout. I'm adamantly anti-blackout, right? If we're serious about climate change, we have to get serious about nuclear, full stop, right? This is obvious to any thinking person that cares about these issues. But in talking about Congress and talking about these other countries, Russia being the obvious one, the Chinese being the other ones, that is it axiomatic if we're going to have a strong nuclear industry in the United States that we have to have strong government backing that is decadal backing, right? That bipartisan, staunch backing, both on the fuel enrichment, disposal, the management, that it is the short answer, a short question. If you're going to be a nuclear country, do you have to have strong government backing to make it happen?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. For the reasons you said. These are multi-decadal investments. They will not be sustained if they flip-flop every 2 or 3 years. And by the way, they are multi-decadal dividends in security. And why does everyone except us seem to understand this? You establish that you are supplying a country's nuclear program. That's a 100-year relationship. That's a 100-year relationship. And it's fundamentally strategic. Many things flow from it, and not just jobs. You're then in the country. You have relationships. They grow. I mean, this is we've been like taking a feather to a knife fight or a knife to a gunfight. You know, the Russian order book, after Westinghouse finished the 4 reactors, which I visited when I was in government in Haiyang and Sanmen, the U.S. order book at that point was 0. The Russian order book was $130 billion. And, you know, they build, own, operate, finance, take the spent fuel back. And we have lots of advantages, but we got to do better, Robert. If we want to have influence globally, we have to do better. The good news is I have never, and I've been doing this almost a half century, I have never seen either an issue or a time that can show greater bipartisan support. 96-3. We just got that. And in the House, it's similar. So we are positioned to be successful. But now, Robert, we got to grasp the brass ring, because it's tragic that it took Ukraine to kind of force this front and center. But my goodness, if they've gotten our attention and we don't do it now, who knows when we're going to get the chance again, or if we'll ever get the chance again.
So I take your points here on what you said, and you're talking about security kind of in the broader national sense of security. I would think about it in terms of energy security as well, and having a stable grid, right? Which I think is absolutely an essential part of this, right? And having baseload power that's affordable, reliable, resilient, all of those things. But I see problems as well, as you know, and I've been thinking about this, writing this piece, the sober look at nuclear energy. What's one of the key problems? Well, fuel availability is one of them. But second, it's this government backing issue where the U.S., particularly on the electric sector, has said, "Oh, we're going to let the market decide." Right? We're going to, which in a lot of other commodities it works, but electricity is a service, not a commodity. And that is that going to be one of the hindrances to the rollout of domestic reactors? Is that they won't work in deregulated electricity markets? So is that going to constrain the rollout?
Yes. I didn't know that's where you're going, Robert. But as usual, I'm finding myself in violent agreement with you. And my last book, which I could find a copy and flash it around here, Double Jeopardy, talks about this. The market does not recognize and does not.
You should always have your books at hand, Dan Poneman. I mean, if you're going to be an author and you don't have your book at hand, what are you doing, man? I mean,
if I can get off stage here for a second.
I've
Wait,
got two. I've got
close the
two right
box.
here. What are you doing? Oh, there it is. All right.
There we
Double
go.
double jeopardy.
Double jeopardy.
Combating
MIT
nuclear.
Press.
What is the subtitle? Combating nuclear
Combating nuclear terror and
and
climate
climate
change.
change. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. You know, I don't know. Call Amazon. I don't know how to find it. Anyway, but no, let me talk about this for just a minute. The market does not recognize the unique attributes of nuclear. There are externalities. The market does not credit it for being carbon free. I can tell you, I got the phone calls from members of Congress in Minnesota in 2014 during the polar vortex when coal stacks froze and natural gas pipelines froze. If it wasn't for the nuclear energy, they would have lost a lot of people. Was it Hurricane Harvey in Texas? You're down there. Nuclear. It has got tremendous benefits that the market does not recognize. Point one, point two,
and the
and
market,
I think
just to clarify, you're talking about the electricity market, right? In these
yes, yes,
deregulated
yes.
markets, Plant Vogtle Unit 3 just came online. Well, that's in a regulated market, right? And it's so, I guess asking another way, would it be possible to build a plant like Vogtle in a deregulated market?
Well, John Rowe, sort of legendary CEO of what was then Exelon, said you need to build a nuclear power plant in a deregulated market, you need $8 natural gas and a $25 price on carbon.
Right.
And that set of circumstances did not present. But there are other problems with the market. So as you know, and now it's been somewhat corrected because of the recent production tax credit. But if wind can sell into the grid at negative 2 cents per kilowatt hour, how can nuclear beat that? You can't bid negative and still get into the bid stack, right? That's another problem. So there's been just tremendous, and I learned a lot from you in your slide deck, the amount of resources poured into the renewables, and I learned a lot from you. We have these metrics called, I just saw it the other day in a newspaper article, the levelized cost of electricity.
Oh,
Well, that's
right.
all
Yeah.
well and good. You probably have written a book. That's all well and good. But what about the backstopping power when, the 75% of the time those renewables aren't operating? What about the high voltage transmission? It'll take, according to Robert Bryce, 150 years when we need it by 2050. So there's any number of these things that have been kind of like impeding the, I think, full deployment, because I believe what you believe. Look, I am passionate about as many things I'm passionate about. I'm most passionate about saving this planet. And if we don't, you saw the commercial liftoff report, the United States alone needs another 200 gigawatts by 2050. And we got to really get on the stick if we're going to have any prayer of getting there.
And I'm sorry, the commercial, I'm not familiar with that. The commercial liftoff report, what was this on for nuclear? Or we need 200 gigawatts?
You will want to read this. I think it came out in around March.
Okay.
And to be clear, it's ecumenical in the sense that I think they say that the United States overall is going to need like 700 gigawatts of additional power generation by 2050. But of that, about 200, if I'm remembering right, has to be nuclear if we're going to meet our net zero targets. You will like this report. You should read it.
Okay. So let's talk about the different types of fuels here, because we've been focused on HALEU, but HALEU is only part of the story. You mentioned earlier, Russia provides 25% of all the enriched uranium, enriched fuel that is now being used in the U.S. Nuclear fleet. But that is all low-enriched uranium in fuel rods that bundles that people are probably familiar with that form factor of what it looks like as they're lowered into the reactor core. But there's also TRISO fuel and HALEU. And can you describe those? Because they're different companies are using, I believe Kairos is using TRISO. HALEU, I think, is Oklo. Other companies, Abilene Christian's reactor needs HALEU. So what are the companies and what are the types of fuel that they need?
Yeah.
And is Centrist only planning and playing in the HALEU sandbox, or what, where are you really focusing your work?
Let me take the last question first, and then I'm going to unpack for your listeners this different flavors of fuel piece. Okay. So The existing market is for low-enriched uranium fuel. Of the 440 or 50 reactors operating around the world, about 400 or 400 plus use low-enriched uranium. Some of them are so-called CANDU reactors from Canada. They actually use natural uranium. We don't have to talk about those.
Right.
If
and
you
low enriched is about 4 to 5%.
Typically 4 to 5%. You
okay.
Think of beer. Think of beer.
Yeah.
Okay. And then if you take Russia out of the equation, the global demand for LEU enrichment is around 48 million SWU. Okay. If you look at global
and SWU, just give us that is that single work unit?
Separative work unit.
Okay. So 48 million
separative work units
per year.
Per year for the world. For the world. Okay.
Gotcha.
Supply, if you take Russia out of the equation, which a lot of people want to do, it's not happened yet, but a lot of people want that to be the end state, is 33 million separative work units or SWU. So that gap, that shortfall, 15 million SWU, that's equal to 100% of US demand per year. Okay. It's also equal to about 10 million, I beg your pardon, about 2/3 of European demand, because I think European demand is between 10 and 11 million SWU per year. So what am I telling you? What I'm telling you is Centrist wants to make LEU to help fill that gap. And we don't think we're the only ones who are going to fill that gap. The incumbents are going to fill the gap, but this is kind of astonishing. People, Robert, find this surprising. There's only 4 significant commercial suppliers of enriched uranium, and they're all state-owned enterprises. It's Russia and its state-owned enterprises, China and its state-owned enterprises, France, and a European consortium called Urenco, which is 1/3 Dutch, 1/3 British, 1/3 German. Okay. And so when the US utilities are looking for energy security, which I agree with you is very important, it's important to them, they're not really thinking about Russia and China anymore for security. And of the Europeans, actually 80% of the US market, between 70 and 80% of the US market is supplied by one company alone, Urenco. And just in terms of economics 101, resilience, avoiding monopoly price risk, et cetera, you want competition in a market. Energy security, go back to the 1913 quote of Winston Churchill. He was talking about oil, but it applies to energy. It's in variety or diversity, and diversity alone. He was right 100 years ago. Okay, so we are very eager to get into that market. And by the way, there's a positive knock-on effect because fixed costs to enrich uranium are very high. The IP is very expensive. The security and seismic testing and the regulations are very expensive. And whether I build 2 or 2,000 machines, it's the same. So if I build a few hundred machines to make HALEU, I get a unit price that's higher than if I'm building thousands of machines to make LEU, and I can spread those costs over so many more customers, right? So that's a huge driver of the economics in enrichment. So that's thing one. And then
so to interrupt, the scale always matters, right? So the scale is going to be, if we're going to get into this, we have to get into it in a big way, and we're going to have government backing. But I just wanted to clarify. So Urenco, I saw them at the IEA meeting in Washington last October. What's the French company? Is that Areva that the one is doing the enrichment?
Well, it used to be called Areva. It's now called Orano. O-R-A-N-O.
Oh, okay, that's right. Okay, right. That was the one I was thinking of. Okay.
And I have nothing, to be clear, I have their competitors, but I have nothing but the highest respect for them, and I think we all should have a very important role in the market. But that's just the kind of taxonomy of who's out there.
Right. And so who's supplying the centrifuges? Are these ones you're going to have to fabricate yourself?
Okay.
Because these are complex machines. I remember when I was in Amori, the JNFL, the Japan Nuclear Fuel Limited, they toured us around, and there was a little window into the centrifuge cascade. And I said, well, how tall? We can't tell you. Well, how fast? We can't tell you. What about we can't tell you. So what can you tell me about where these are complicated machines? You can't go to buy them at Walmart, at Target. Where do you get them?
Robert, I'm beginning to think we were separated at birth. I went to Aomori Prefecture about 25 years ago. I looked through that little window. I said, how big are those machines? They said, we can't tell you. I said, how fast do they spin? They said, we can't tell you. Right. So I don't know what's going on here. Point one. Point two, there aren't many sources of supply of the machines. It happens that the two European companies have a joint venture called ETC. So actually, that company, ETC, makes the machines for both the Urenco and Orano companies. The Japanese, the Chinese, the Russians, they all make their own. Okay. We make our own. We actually, I mentioned we have this manufacturing facility. We make almost all of the parts ourselves. 440,000 square foot capacity facility in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. We are building out the supply chain. At one time, when we had the larger kind of the old version of building only massively, we had a huge supply chain of like 900 suppliers. But now we're building out a much leaner, smaller. It's still over several states, but most of the work we can do right within our factory, and then we ship those parts to a very large, like Pentagon-sized building, set of buildings actually, in Piketon, Ohio, and that's where you'll see the picture. That's where the actual machines are sitting, and they will spin. We lease that property from the U.S. Department of Energy. So I'm going to pause. I haven't forgotten your other question about TRISO, et cetera, but I don't want to stop you before you wanted to finish this topic.
Well, no, that's good because so you're to just reiterate. So then Centrist is manufacturing its own centrifuges.
Yes, we do have subcontractors and suppliers, but most of the parts we make ourselves.
Gotcha. And in Piketon, because we talked about power demand earlier, and there's something very interesting to me, obviously, and grid demand and so on. So in Piketon, Ohio, who's your power supplier there?
We get, I believe, we got to check this. I think we get power off the grid there.
Okay. Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So LEU, we've talked about that 4 to 5% enriched uranium that goes into these fuel bundles that are, I forgot, 18 feet long, something like that. They're long and are lowered into the reactor cores. Is the HALEU form factor the same? TRISO form factor? Let's talk about those. What does it look like?
You have to have two axes, Robert.
Okay.
This is you're getting a little bit of apples and oranges going there. So along one axis is the assay of the fuel. It's actually not really done this way, but just for illustration. So 4 or 5% LEU, 90% naval reactors and bombs, 19.75% HALEU.
Okay.
And the reason why is the legal limit between low and high is 20% for reasons I won't go into. And why that matters is after 20%, you get a lot more what we call guards, dogs, and lights because of the risk of diversion to weapons.
Okay.
And therefore, if I'm a reactor developer and I want enhanced performance that you get with these advanced reactors, which you know all about, smaller packages, less waste, et cetera, you get as close to that line as you can without crossing it. So 19.75%. And there are other assays that people use, don't get me wrong, but that's why it seems like a somewhat arbitrary number, but it's not. But the other thing is what form it takes, because first of all, you mentioned, let's just to be clear on the taxonomy here. In advanced reactor space, there's light water reactor designs, and then there's non-light water, or you could consider it slow neutrons and fast neutrons. I'm going to explain this in very short order. The light water reactor ones are really miniature versions of the existing fleet that everyone's familiar with. That would be Westinghouse has just announced one. You mentioned the GE BWRX 300. That would be NuScale. That would be terrestrial. Okay. So they use low enriched uranium fuel. The ones that use fast neutrons no longer use traditional H2O light water coolant as most reactors do. Now you use like liquid metal for coolant. Okay. So that would be, for example, TerraPower and Oklo. Okay. Right. Then you have some that actually have a molten salt in which the fuel is mixed in with a molten salt. And that's a joint venture that you'll see between GE and TerraPower. They're doing with Southern Company. And then you have ones that actually use an oxide, but in the oxide, then there are subsets. And one of the subsets of an oxide is an oxide that goes into this so-called TRISO fuel pellet, which is an ingenious thing in which you have multiple layers of ceramic coating with the actual fuel pellet. And the advantage of that, Robert, which you probably have had those people on your show, is you don't need those big, like my book cover with the big containments anymore, because each little tiny pellet is its own containment. And so you have a major increase in the safety margin and so on and so on. So we can make, and so for example, we work very closely with X Energy, which makes triso fuel. As you know, their reactor will use triso fuel, but it's triso HALEU, right? So the HALEU can go into either a triso fuel pellet or a liquid metal fuel design that a company like TerraPower or Oklo would need.
Good. Well, thank you, because I need a diagram to understand these different, and I've seen them before, but I'm sometimes the info goes in and just goes out the other direction. So, so the X Energy Triso uses HALEU, right? But it's a different form factor that is actually in the reactor itself. So what we'll look forward then, and blue sky this for me, Dan. So, and again, my guest is Dan Poneman. He's the CEO of Centrist Energy. He's been half a century, you said, or so in the nuclear sector in one way or another. You can find out more about Centrist at centristenergy.com. Their investor presentation, their latest one, is from May, which lays out a lot of these issues that we're talking about here. It's called the Nuclear Fuel Market Opportunity. So, blue sky this for me. I asked you to do this because I was I spoke at a meeting in Idaho Falls about, maybe 10 years ago. And I asked the NuScale people, okay, blue sky it for me. When are you going to get your reactor deployed? They said, 2025, 2026. Well, now they're saying somewhat later. Blue sky this for me in the United States. How soon will we have, forget the Vogtle reactors, right? But the new SMR deployments, everything goes right with the NRC, with fuel availability. How soon will we have, say, 5,000 megawatts of new nuclear capacity on the grid in the United States? How soon could that happen?
That's a tough one. If everything goes the way I think it should go, we're going to have to ramp up the supply chain.
Right.
I'd want to go back, honestly, and see how fast we were building them in the heyday of like the 1980s. But at a rate of 5,000 a year?
No, just to reach total of. The reason I ask is because, look, again, I'm adamantly pro-nuclear, but people forget the scale of the generation fleet in the United States. We're at 1.2 terawatts, 1,250 gigawatts. So, well, let's just even say 1 gigawatt. We have 1,200 gigawatts now. How soon could we have 1 gigawatt of new, we'll call them advanced reactors, not the Vogtle, put Vogtle aside, but 1,000 megawatts, 1 gigawatt. How soon could we have 1 gigawatt of new nuclear generation capacity online in the United States?
If Robert Bryce and Dan Poneman got to call the shots.
Well, all right. Well, that's not fair.
Well, why not?
Okay, I'm going to wave my hand and say it all shall happen as soon as possible. How soon could it happen?
If we did it, if it's a can and not a will, I would say if we put our minds to it, we could get that done by 2030. If we put our minds to it.
1 gigawatt in 7 years.
I think so. I don't think that's actually crazy. I mean, I can't help. I'm a student of history. You are too. I don't remember how long it took to make Liberty ships in 1941.
Right.
But by 1944, we got them down to like 9 days each.
Right.
I don't remember how many aircraft we had in 1939, but by 1944, we had 150,000. I don't think that the challenge of saving our planet is less grave than what we faced in the early 1940s. So we got to get serious about this stuff. You've heard 1,000 of these things. Here's just one last, it's a very interesting little illustration. You'll be surprised to learn that people thought they were going to use horses to tow artillery pieces around Europe in any future European land war.
Right.
And so we had a horse breeding program in the U.S. Army. Okay, so guess what? You can't surge horse production because that's like biologically impossible, right? So now comes World War II, and we look around, we go like, rut-row, not working. What are we going to do? They put out an RFP for a four-wheeled vehicle that would basically do what a horse could have done in terms of moving artillery pieces around Europe. And I can't remember if it was 9 weeks but very short period of time. They got Willys Overland in Toledo, Ohio, and it's a thing they ended up calling it something like the Jeep, something like that. And I think there were like 644,000 produced by 1944, right? And I think Eisenhower called it one of the three strategic inventions that won the war. And then, by the way, so then they go, well, wait a second, the war's over. Now what? Well, guess what? Turns out most of the American farms were still using horse-drawn plows and stuff. So then they went commercial, and then it turned into a recreational vehicle. So what I'm telling you is there's a national security imperative. We get the thing started, and don't underestimate American innovation and the power of the marketplace to make this thing successful. We just have to grasp the nettle, and we can do this. I think as a country, we can do this. I know I've said it twice already, but just think about a 96-3 vote. That tells you something important about this country. And when we recognize we're really up against it, we can do big things.
And the three were Bernie Sanders, Jeff Merkley, and Bernie Sanders, right?
No,
Markey,
Sanders.
Markey, Merkley, and
no, I got this. It was no disrespect to anyone. It was Senator Markey, Senator Elizabeth Warren, and Senator Bernie Sanders. They were the three.
Okay. All right. I thought Ed Markey was the other one, but that's okay. Whatever it was.
No, Ed Markey. Ed
okay, Markey. Okay, you said the other.
You said Merkley.
Yeah, I don't know, whatever it is. So those three.
He's on the other coast.
The Luddites, or whatever. Well, last question then about down blending, because we talked about, and then we've been talking for more than an hour now, so I want to close. But we talked about megatons to megawatts, which was a down blending project, right? You had very high levels of highly enriched uranium that you then down blended. The U.S. government, and Matt Wald and I talked about this, has pretty substantial quantities of highly enriched uranium. Why couldn't Centrist then use some of that and then turn that into HALEU? What is this? DOD is saying, no, never mind, that's ours, dibs on this. What is that a possibility here, or you think that that happening, or have I misapprehended what the possibility is here?
No, not really. I'm smiling because you asked all these questions that, as the pal Joey musical says, if you asked me, I could write a book. So look, the bottom line is this. First of all, I'm just going to make, you might even call it an aesthetic argument. To spend a king's ransom, taking this raw stuff out of the ground and putting into pure spun gold of this high octane HEU, which is precious, precious stuff, and then just dilute it back to the stuff it came out of, strikes me as a promiscuous, prodigious waste of taxpayer money. I think it's insane. Okay. To put too fine a point on it. Okay. That having been said, this has in fact been the policy of the United States of America for a number of years. And the actual numbers are, of course, classified. But over years, there have been, and I was part of this under 1995 at the White House, President Clinton declared a certain amount of HU as excess to national security needs and available for these other peaceful uses. But the bottom line is, every time you do that, two things happen. Number one, you basically are eating the seed corn of our national security. And number two, you're allowing the continued atrophy and pathetic collapse of our industrial base needed in the long term to provide it. Here's a short anecdote, true story. I'm in the government. I won't say where, but it was roughly 2010. I've always believed what I believe today. It's not because I'm running this company. It's because this is what I think is right for the country and our world in terms of enriching uranium. And I said we should be creating a new capacity to replace those old plants that are shutting down. And people laughed at me in the government. And I said, I know why you think it's funny, because we have a lot and you can blend that stuff down. But I said, when you run out, are you going to use coal or wind power to get under the polar ice caps with your submarines? Or do you think perhaps Vladimir Putin will bail you out? And I was told in response, Dan, you're 10 years too early. That was 2010. I'm not a math major. That's more than 10 years ago. So it's way past time. The bottom line is we will need to do this in the long term. And the only thing that happens by delaying is we continue losing influence, we continue losing supply chain, we continue losing expertise, and we continue ceding the high terrain and both the economic, manufacturing, employment, national security, non-proliferation, supply chain resilience to all the other state-owned enterprises while we sit here and just atrophy. Otherwise, it's a great idea.
Nicely said. You can get off the stump now, but that was good. I like that. That was no. Well, look, so I'm going to condense what you just said. Well, to take that high, you called it HU or the HEU?
HEU, high enriched uranium.
High enriched uranium. So 90%. So we need that for Defense Department. We need that for our nuclear submarines, nuclear carriers, et cetera. Okay. So I'm condensing what you just said into much.
Right.
You did a good job of expanding it to those other things, which is great. Okay, so last two questions, and these are questions I ask all my guests. What are you reading? You talked about writing another book, but what books are on your top of your pile these days? Or are you so involved in lobbying in DC and other things that you don't have time to read? Tell me what are you doing?
Yeah, not the latter for sure. I'm really enjoying Unlikely Heroes by a friend of mine, actually, somebody who was the founding editor of International Security, Derek Liebart. I haven't seen him in 40 plus years. It's about Harry Hopkins, Francis Perkins, Harold Ickes, and Henry Wallace, and supporting FDR. And I'm just up to the 100 days, and I'm thinking of how we should analogize that period of 100 days to this. I'm also very much enjoying, I can't read enough about Lincoln, And Then There Was Light, a wonderful book, John Meacham. You know, it's strange to think of people like Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan and Zachary Taylor as kind of living politicians, but he really makes it come to life on a kind of completely different front, because I'm a bit of a workout freak. I've finished an interesting book called Outlived by Peter Attia about how to live longer and better and so forth. And basically any history I can get my hands on. But those are the three that I'm working on right now.
Good. Okay. That's a good list. And what gives you hope, Dan? We've talked about a lot of things that could cause despair in lesser humans, but what gives you hope these days?
Robert, I do see, and candidly, you're part of this. I do see a growing recognition in more and more people that climate change is not theoretical and that urgent action is required. And it's becoming, in a good sense, much more mainstream. Unlikely allies are popping up. And that's a good thing, because, as you said about 10 minutes ago, without a deep and broad bipartisan consensus at a time where we don't find much, frankly, on most things, I think this issue is one where you can find that. And I'll end on this note, because it only came up peripherally. Most of my life has been spent on national security issues, actually. And what I say in this book is you can support nuclear energy even if you don't agree on why, because there might be some people who care a lot about defending our homeland and deterring our geostrategic adversaries, and in the importance of a continued robust, safe, secure, and reliable deterrent. And I believe in that. And you get that through the arsenal, which is supported by enriched uranium, and by the naval reactors, which is supported by enriched uranium. And you could also not care about that at all, but care a lot about the planet being effectively incinerated, and see that nuclear is an absolutely critical path item to achieve our objectives there too. So I think this is a moment of incredible hope in that respect. And frankly, it's what keeps me going every day.
Well, that's a good place to stop then. We'll stop right there then. My guest has been Dan Poneman. He's the CEO of Centrist Energy. I've been meaning to have him on the podcast for a long time, and I hope you understand why, because he knows these issues very well and is in the middle of some of the most important issues in the nuclear sector in America today. You can find more about his company, Centrist Energy, at centristenergy.com. Dan, thanks a million for coming on the Power Hungry podcast. I learned a lot and had great fun with it.
Thank you for hosting, and good luck with everything, including your music.
that I need help on that one. Okay, and to all you out there in podcast land, thanks for tuning into this episode of the Power Hungry podcast. Until next time, see ya.